'cause you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Or when you can't, you won't, and you don't stop.
The last couple of modules have been looking at how we work with others and then how we structure our business to work with others. As part of that discussion, we started looking at the challenges that arise when we have a separate legal entity, the company, right, which is the structure that's adopted by most reasonably sized businesses within Australia. So the question that becomes a bit of a problem when we have a company is how do we make a legal fiction kind of responsible or accountable? And to do that, we have to go through to understand how that occurs, we have to go through some principles about what accountability and regulation is, and then how the law actually operates to try and make organisations accountable. How do we make people who are working together accountable for their actions, particularly, say, when others are telling them what to do in a business setting? So why don't we hop into that by looking first at what we mean by regulation and accountability. Now, when we use the term regulation, most people will think of law, as we've talked about legislation or case-based law, and that's true, that is a form of regulation. But regulation is really any approach that we use. It can be norms and or rules and laws to control the behaviours of others. When we're talking about business law, we're actually talking about the control of organisations and activities, as well as the control of individuals. So let's have a look at a couple of these definitions. So because we are talking about business law, we're talking about the control, as we've said, of corporate and commercial activities. Okay. We've also mentioned that it's beyond the system of rules, which could be law or other rules, as we'll come to, and it includes norms. Okay. And these norms and rules can come from the government or private actors or some combination of the two. So it actually means regulation is very complex. We do not necessarily need involvement of the state. It could be private actors who undertake regulation. Particularly, we can see in business, we get regulation occurring by industry associations, professional bodies, and other groups who do that. So we're trying to control, govern, or direct this corporate and commercial activities. I think it's important to understand that regulation without accountability is unlikely to be successful to get the outcome that you're after. Now, what do we mean by accountability? Look, there's lots of different definitions, but it really, at its heart, has to do with someone having to justify or explain what they did. That justification also must have consequences for the person making it, okay? So we need some way that people have to feed back what they did and justify what they did, and then there has to be consequences, positive and or negative, for what they actually do. Without that arena, all the regulation or rules in the world won't make much use. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that when you just have regulation or rules that are not enforced, in which there's no accountability, then they're worse than not actually having regulations because people know that they can ignore it and they don't have to think for themselves about these particular issues. So regulation and accountability go together like a yin-yang, right? Regulation without accountability is probably at best useless, at worst it can actually be destructive. And similarly, accountability without an expectation, without a regulation, is unfair. How can you hold people accountable for something that they don't know that they had to do? So these are kind of two sides of the same coin that we need to understand in the business setting. As well as understanding it, we need to think about the widespread or broad nature of accountability. Yes, we have accountability in a legal sense to the courts and to the authorities and to the regulators. So we have regulations provided by government and then an accountability mechanism through the courts and or regulators. But we also have accountability through things like the market. Right? The market makes people accountable for the products that they actually produce. There are positive and negative outcomes, how much you sell, based upon the expectations or what the market wants. So markets can make us accountable. And we see that through, for instance, increasing use of boycotts or directing your purchases to particular providers because we see them as producing the product in a way that maybe we want. So this accountability is not just about price in the market. There's a broader sense of market accountability. And in fact, if you go on in your studies around business and corporate governance, etc., you'll come across concepts like the market for corporate control, which says that the stock market is an accountability mechanism. You know, last week we talked about the shareholders being the residual claimants that get what's left over. So that if you're not providing them enough in dividends or enough profitability, one of the things that can happen is some other people come over, buy the shares, and then get rid of the managers. Okay, so the managers are accountable via that market mechanism in the stock market. So that's another example of market accountability. And finally, we all know that we're accountable within organisations, often to a department like HR, and mainly through to your boss, right? We're accountable for the power that we're given and the tasks we're asked to undertake. So accountability works in multiple different ways. It can work as a market mechanism, it can work as a legal mechanism, it can work as a hierarchy, and it can work as a social norm as well, right? So accountability is a very broad spectrum of activities that regulate business activity. Now, the final key concept that we want to think about is the source of regulation, right? So often we think regulation is something that's put on us. Okay, so yes, in a sense, criminal law, all law, right, is imposed by the state on us. It's part of the contract between the citizen and the state, for want of a better way of thinking about it, although you can't actually accept it, so it's not really a contract. But you get the idea, right? So the state imposes this regulation and accountability on us. But that's not the only accountability that we have, right? And regulation. Sometimes people take on regulation voluntarily. So in a business setting, if a company lists on the Australian Securities Exchange, the ASX, they become subject to a form of regulation called the listing rules. So if you want to list on the Securities Exchange, there's a set of rules that you have to comply with. Now, you don't have to comply with them if you're not listed. It's only if you agree to be listed. So in that way, you're contractually taking on this regulation. Similarly, you might join an industry body. Right? You might join a profession. You voluntarily join that profession and so take on these series of regulations. And then at a final level, an organisation can have a set of values or a policy. There's nothing that says any company must follow this set of values or particularly these policies. Sometimes they're aligned with the law, but imagine we have a policy that has really nothing to do with the law. Well, in that case, it's solely a voluntary self-regulation that you're undertaking. So companies are always working with these multiple sources of regulation. They can adjust some. Right? They can adjust self-regulation and voluntary regulation, and they can't adjust some, like legal regulation from the government.